Hello, welcome to On Becoming a Healer. I'm Stefan Kertes. This episode, we're going to interrogate two surprising claims about medical training that were offered recently in the New England Journal of Medicine. One came in a commentary and then in a closely related podcast that followed. These claims are, one, that the culture of medical education has shifted to prioritize the wellness and comfort of students and trainees, and that it's shifted too far in ways that will harm their training as doctors. And two, today's medical educators have wound up uniquely vulnerable to social media embarrassment and complaining by trainees. And this new vulnerability puts educators at risk of compromising their duty to medical trainees. Okay, what we will attempt today is a thoughtful, accurate discussion of the individual ideas and stories that appear in both the New England Journal podcast and the editorial. Then you could decide for yourself. Now, just for reference, the podcast is from February 14th, 2024, New England Journal of Medicine NOS podcast. It's called Tough Love and features Dr. Lisa Rosenbaum and Dr. Amy Holthauser. The commentary is actually from a month earlier, written by Dr. Rosenbaum alone, and the term to search is necessary discomfort. As always, I'm here to discuss this with my co-host, Saul Wiener. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
So tell me why we're diving into the claims in this podcast in this article at this time.
So a number of people have independently shared either the article, the piece that was in the New England Journal of Medicine, and by the way, the full title for that is Being Well While Doing Well, Distinguishing Necessary from Unnecessary Discomfort in Training. And as you said, that was written by Lisa Rosenbaum. And then there was the NOS, or Not Otherwise Specified, New England Journal podcast, and that was a conversation between Dr. Rosenbaum and a physician, Amy Holthauser. And that episode was called Tough Love. And what struck me looking at the article and then listening to the podcast, the conversation seemed to be just full of missed opportunities for dialogue between essentially these two parties, medical educators and trainees including medical students. And so I felt like this would be a great opportunity for us to talk about what some of those missed opportunities might be, at least as I see it. And I've had an opportunity to share both the podcast and the article with medical students and residents just to get some of their thoughts as well. And I can relay some of what I learned from that in addition. Also, I think this is a theme that is very much aligned with the mission of this podcast, which is really focused on the whole trajectory of becoming a physician and the culture in which we train. And I think there are some major cultural issues here. I think we're at a point in the history of medicine where there's, maybe revolution is too strong a word, but I think there's a real change that's happening in terms of the power structure between attendings or educators and students and trainees. It was typically very hierarchical. Of course, you and I know that, Stefan, because we came up through that hierarchical process where basically you did what you were told and you worked as hard as you were told and you just showed up and you didn't walk away until you were told you could and so forth. And I think what's happened now is that there's been a dramatic shift, in part and maybe to a large extent driven by the power that social media has given in terms of a voice for trainees. And that has been disturbing for many medical educators. In some cases, they're downright threatened and angry about it. And it's caused a lot of disruption. And I think what we hear listening to the podcast and reading the New England Journal of Medicine piece is, from my point of view, just one side of the story. We're hearing the educator's side. And I think that there is complexity here that's being overlooked. And as I said, missed opportunities to consider that now's a chance for a different kind of conversation between educators and trainees beyond the sort of traditional hierarchical one. And that's what I'm hoping we can talk about today.
Yeah, no, I'm eager to. Let's dive into it. The main premise in both pieces, and certainly in the podcast, is that trainees are demanding comfort and well-being, and that they are demanding these things, and that it's getting in the way of good training. There's a quote from Dr. Holthauser from the podcast itself, which starts with a comment on wellness days. For people who don't know, this is something like a personal day that you can get at work, where you say, I need to be absent today so that I can proceed to take care of something I need to take care of. And there's a modest number of those that have been allocated to medical students, which didn't formally exist. So I'd like to read one of those quotes and just get your reactions. And here's what Dr. Holthauser says. I think that wellness days are one of a whole host of things that students might ask about or for. And on its face, it's not necessarily a problem. The question is the wellness days are in addition to what? Because 3 years ago, maybe, or in our case, 10 years ago, students asked to have the day prior to their shelf exam, that's a standardized exam, off for clerkships, and they got it. And then students asked that the day before that be a half day, and they got it. And then students asked, what's really the benefit of us having any overnight call on these clerkships? And so students went from having overnight calls in obstetrics, internal medicine, surgery, pediatrics, psychiatry, to only having one or two overnight calls in their entire medical student career in the surgery clerkship. And so I think it's not that there's any single request or any single wish list item for students or for wellness that's in and by itself triggering a concern. I think it's that there's an awful lot of creep going on. And if you look at the differences from 10 years ago to now, or 5 years ago to now, they're pretty stark. So there's that portrait. They asked for stuff, they got it. They asked for more, they asked for more. If I were to defend this, I could say, look, how do I know that honoring all these requests is making them better students? Maybe it's making them worse students, and they're just asking for stuff. What say you?
So, it's funny. I was thinking back to when I was a third-year medical student, and it was the Friday of Thanksgiving. And I was chatting with another student about whether we could safely request to have that day off so that we could be away with our families. And we decided it was just too risky to even bring it up. We were told we could have Thanksgiving off, but we should basically not leave town so that we could be back on that Friday. And so we both missed out on Thanksgiving with our families, and we got, of course, to come in on that Friday. And what strikes me looking back on it is that I think the idea that made us better doctors is dubious at best. And so I think what is called for when you look at Dr. Holthauser's comment here is a conversation about where the sweet spot is. The implication of this is sort of like, you give them an inch, they take a mile. We keep giving them additional time off or wellness days or whatnot, and then they keep asking for more and so on and so forth. And I think we can agree, at least I certainly feel that the old days were the bad old days. Look, when you and I trained, there were no duty hour limits. As I said, when you're a medical student, you just kept your mouth shut because God forbid they thought that you weren't passionate about every moment you were there. And I don't think that was the right spot. And I think the question is, what is the right spot? And when I shared this with some of the medical students, they said, look, we know we're going to work hard as residents, but how is this type of deprivation going to help us now prepare for that? And I think that's an open question. Maybe there is some value, maybe there isn't. And I think what's needed here is that conversation. The other thing I think that's really important is that the term creep is used here, as in there's an awful lot of creep, which is, in my view, a kind of pejorative statement and implies that, that the whole thing is just getting pushed and pushed and pushed in the direction of, more time off and so forth. And the key issue is who's making those final decisions. Of course, those decisions are not made by the students. Those decisions are made by the educators, often by the deans, the clerkship directors, and they have absolutely the right to draw a line and say, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to give that to you. But the key is to have an open, good faith conversation where there's a genuine interest in finding what's right, such that the educators are open to the idea that maybe these changes are to some degree good for the well-being and the health of medical students. And medical students are open to the idea that there is value in being present. And I think that medical students are good faith actors for the most part, and I think educators are good faith actors for the most part. But I think the educators are the one who still have the most power and the most responsibility for setting the tone. And that's what I think is missing here. In both the podcast and the New England Journal of Medicine article, I never heard the voice of the student or the trainee. I only heard the voice of the educator. And so that I thought was concerning, and it leaves half of the conversation. I mean, there is no conversation if you're not hearing both voices. And so I think that's what's missing from this type of judgment, where phrases like awful lot of creep are used.
Yeah, awful lot of creep usually does kind of imply that whoever's causing the creep is a problem. Do you think we should adjudicate the specific requests? If you have to take a test that is going to test your knowledge in medicine, that's really important for your grade in medicine, which will be important for your residency. Saying that you should have a day or a day and a half off before you take that test doesn't sound to me like I'm asking for a day and a half off to go play laser tag. It sounds to me like I want to do a good job. So on face, I would not have thought that educators were conceding or giving up on an educational mission for that purpose. In what framework does saying your time to study is a concession to you? How do educators get to the point that they say, studying, that's the kind of thing that we only concede to you if we're forced to?
I think one of the issues here is whether we respect medical students as adults who are actually trying to do what's best for their education. And one of my concerns is that throughout the podcast, they are referred to repeatedly as children.
Oh, yes,
and
they are.
I marked off, I actually highlighted all the areas where they are referred to as children. And I think it's important to actually call that out, because when I was a medical student, I did feel like I was treated like what came to mind was as a 10th grader, a high school 10th grader. That's kind of what I felt. That's sort of where I felt I was being placed. And I was in my mid-20s. And so I think that way of viewing students is inherently disrespectful and implies that they are not capable of having an adult-to-adult conversation about what's best for their education and what's best for patient care.
Why don't we read these? Let's trade off. We'll do some readings about these references to medical students as kids.
Sure,
Does that sound
why not?
all right? I'll take the first. This is from Dr. Holthauser in the podcast. The feeling that trainees have that nobody cares about them and nobody cares about their well-being is so the opposite of the truth. It feels a lot like when you're coping with teenagers as a parent and you can't seem to bridge that gap. Why don't you go, Saul?
So there's another one here. We are so anxious as medical educators to make sure that our children are happy that we've forgotten that our main goal here is not to make them happy. Our main goal is to provide them with education, mentorship, coaching, and guidance.
Here, I'll go. Dr. Rosenbaum says, there's a pervasive anxiety among educators, and I want to understand what that anxiety is about. Dr. Holthauser responds, truthfully, I think, again, the experience that it feels the most like is the experience of being a parent. It's the anxiety about having to have a tough conversation, not only one-on-one with one person, but with a whole class of students, for example, or a whole cadre of students, and say, I understand that this is what you're asking for. I understand that this is how you think it's going to help you. My observation is we've done this, and this that are all similar in vein, and it hasn't helped.
And then shortly after that, Dr. Holthauser continues, when you come from a place of love in all of the work that you do with students, it feels very much like when you love your patients or when you love your kids, but your kid does something terrible.
And then Dr. Rosenbaum reads a quote from Dr. Holthauser. We need to be much more okay with them struggling and blaming us for how they feel and supporting each other as educators, so we are not made to feel like we are bad parents for not fixing their feelings or sentiments on surveys. Good parents allowed their children to struggle. So that's a lot of kid references.
It is. And I think that that's deeply problematic because, first of all, they're not kids. And secondly, seeing them through that lens, in my view, is a way of trying to maintain the old hierarchy. The hierarchy, which is that we're the ones who know best. You don't have the maturity, and that means you need to listen to what we tell you. I certainly know that when I shared this with students, some of whom have had professional careers before going to medical school. I mean, we have medical students who have been engineers, who have been attorneys, who've done all kinds of stuff. I have one who was a healthcare consultant. For them, this is odd. It's problematic. It's kind of bizarre. And I don't know. Have you shared this with anyone?
Yeah, I talked to students who also pointed out that they're coming into medicine as adults who very often had careers elsewhere, and that it felt strange to them to be seen as needy children. That's not who they think of themselves as. So, and that's not who I think of them as either. I must say, I don't interact with students or residents as if they're my kids. So it's a peculiar situation, and it does. I just wonder if it's infusing some of this discussion, although I don't want to show a lack of understanding. If you are in a position of leadership, and let's talk about that. So if you're in a position of leadership and you are subject to complaint, I think it's a tough job. I see this for senior managers in hospitals. I believe you get blamed a lot for all sorts of things. And I could imagine that being a senior leader in a medical school could involve being blamed and criticized and feeling a little bit like you're under the gun. Maybe we're being unfair here, Saul, in not recognizing just how tough it is to be criticized all the time.
Well, I think that speaking now for physicians, that many who have come up through the hierarchical system are ill prepared to have a reset and relate to medical students and residents as junior colleagues with an openness to the idea that what they have to say, even if it challenges long-standing views about the culture of medicine, how we are trained, is worthy of hearing, discussing, considering, and taking seriously. I remember when I was a young program director, there were conversations about having duty hour restrictions. At the time, shortly after you and I trained, there was a major shift from basically having no duty hour restrictions to actually an 80-hour limit. And at the time, there was a lot of pushback from physicians who had been through the process. They were like, oh, doctors are going to be completely unprepared. They're not going to be trained. And how can you ever be a good doctor if you're only working 80 hours a week and so forth? And I think that's wrong. There was so much evidence, even at the time, that level of fatigue was imprudent, was unsafe, and actually, the push for change didn't come from within the profession. It was ultimately mandated. Congress basically threatened to step in if the ACGME didn't start regulating work hours. And so, I think we have to understand that we don't have a great culture within medicine of looking out for the next generation, for creating a positive atmosphere. There's an enormous amount of mistreatment. We actually did an episode on medical student mistreatment, and it varies from 25 to 75. I think it was about average 40% of medical students report mistreatment on the AAMC GQ survey. And these are not minor things. There are 8 categories of mistreatment, including things like public humiliation, harassment, sexual harassment, and so forth. So I think we have to understand that it's not like we're starting with this wonderful culture and wonderful profession, and the new generation is trying to muck it all up. That's clearly not true. And so I think we have to start from the premise that there are big problems and that therefore conversations about change are needed. And now, perhaps for the first time, the new generation has an opportunity to speak up. They can go on social media and so forth. That doesn't mean they're not going to misuse it. That doesn't mean they're not going to demand things that are unreasonable. They're imperfect too. But there is finally an opportunity for conversation, and trying to put the genie back with this idea of, oh, we just have to go back to tough love, strikes me as a missed opportunity.
There's a defensive element in the podcast that I want to share, and I'll read you a quote from Dr. Holthauser. I think some of the interesting things to me about when people talk about well-being and talk about why it's important, they really choose to frame it as if people running medical schools and medical institutions don't already want to do what's right. The first thing is to realize that the people who are running your medical schools and who are running your residency programs and who are running your institutions of care, by and large, are the same people who want to do what's right always, including with their trainees. And the feeling that trainees have that nobody cares about them and nobody cares about their well-being is so the opposite of the truth. And I want to just highlight that there's another way to take the criticism other than as a critique of the good intentions of medical school leaders. That is, if somebody, on a hard day, when somebody tells me it's not working out for me, you're not doing it right, I say, wait a second, I have the best of intentions. You're not giving me credit. On a different day, if somebody says it's not working out for me, things aren't feeling right the way we're doing this, I say, okay, maybe it really isn't. Tell me why not. And I think what you're saying in a way is that the defense of good intentions doesn't have to be offered. We're actually not convinced that there's any poor intentions at all by either side, but we'd love to see the conversation move to, maybe it isn't right. Tell me why not. Let's have that conversation. Is that fair to say, Saul?
Yeah, in fact, I think if you go back 20 plus years when there was this debate over whether to have duty hour restrictions at all, I think that The physicians who were pushing for the status quo actually did think that they were doing the right things for their trainees, that, that if their trainees had duty hour restrictions and worked, say, out 80 hours a week, that was not going to be adequate for them to become prepared as physicians, and they wouldn't be toughened up and so forth. Of course, there wasn't evidence for that. There was a lot of evidence to the contrary, but, they went through it. They thought it worked for them, and that's what they were pushing for. And I think that it wasn't that they were like sadistic. I don't think that's what was going on. But I think that the problem is that the power structure was such that the residents and the medical students didn't really have a voice. And so I think that to simply say, we love you and therefore we know what's right, is frankly kind of naive in my view. I mean, I think, in fact, at one point she says, we all love our students, all of us. And obviously that either isn't
That
true.
can't be true.
I kind of doubt it's I doubt it's true. But even if it were true, as I said, 40% of students on average report mistreatment. So I think we have to acknowledge that whatever you want to say, we love them, we don't love them, whatever it is, there are problems. And those problems are significant enough that they require dialogue.
I want to chip in before I turn to one other quote from the podcast, and then we're going to go to Dr. Rosenbaum's article. I want to chip in that I would like to frame this as outside the world of love. It comes up repeatedly that love should be how we think about medical training. And I understand that there's no implication here that it should be a romantic love. But I would like to believe that when we're trying to do a good job in education, we would do it even for the student who made us uncomfortable. That we would owe that student precisely the same level of high quality training, even if we thought, you know what, I don't really fit with this student. They're not really my type.
Absolutely.
Okay, there's one last bit from the podcast we're going to talk to before I turn to the editorial, and it is this idea that student complaints carry enormous power and can actually result in potential threats. I think there were potentially problems with the LCME, or that there could be a threat against the teacher. In fact, there's this quote here from Dr. Holthauser, and she says, well, gosh, my boss is going to hear from the provost if an angry student writes an email. What if an angry student writes an email to the LCME? What if I get sued by a student? These are all things that have happened either to me or to people that I'm close to in medical education. What if I get personally sued? What if I get death threats from an ex-student that's been dismissed for unprofessional behavior? So none of these are wild stories. If you ask people, they know people or they've personally been through it. And I just want us to pause, is this portrait of the power of students to threaten and unsettle the lives of medical educators one that we can document or we can test? Is it resonant? I mean, where does it sit?
Well, as you know, I was at one time Senior Associate Dean of Medical Education at my own institution, and I had a lot of interaction with the LCME, which was a while ago. Their social media was far less developed at the time. There is a survey that medical students are asked to actually lead, not only answering questions that are given to them, but creating their own questions and so forth. They can certainly say anything that they want as a collective. And I suppose that could single out certain educators who could get in trouble. I mean, all that's possible. I'm pausing here because I personally feel like it's overwrought. I don't think that medical educators are, unless they're serious issues, are at risk in most cases. And if they are, that would suggest political issues at their own institutions. If a dean were to fire somebody who was actually good simply because there were some negative comments on a survey, to me that would raise major concerns about the leadership at that institution rather than with the students themselves. I mean, I think that in both the New England Journal article and in the podcast episode, over and over again, this theme comes up of we don't feel safe as educators. And, I just have to say, I'm going to accept that at face value. I have not personally experienced that sense myself. I haven't heard other faculty raising it. Have you, by the way?
I have not, and I also contacted someone high up in the medical education establishment of a major medical school, and they said that they were not constantly in fear of being reported, and they didn't think that the frequency of such reports has increased. But at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that in the podcast, Dr. Rosenbaum says that she was contacted by lots of people saying that this is an operational fear. So I don't think we're done with that subject exactly. We can't say we know for sure that this is not really happening.
So let's take that at face value. And my view, and maybe you can say I'm being naive here, is that that's why you need courage to lead. So if you have gone through the process of having open, good faith conversations with medical students and residents about any of these issues regarding call schedule or wellness days, and you are truly interested in working with them with the understanding that they have a shared commitment to their education, that they're not children. If you have that and you don't reach a consensus, then you will have to make perhaps an unpopular decision and stand by it. Now, if you don't have the courage to do that, then you should not be in a position of leadership. What I will say, however, is based on the conversation in the podcast where these learners are constantly referred to as children, I am skeptical that there are, in fact, peer-to-peer conversations in which the educators are seeing these learners as adults because they're saying they don't. And again, if you're not seeing them as adults, then everything I just said does not apply, because if you're making what I would call heavy-handed decisions because you don't see them as adults, and then they go and complain about you on social media, in my view, you're kind of asking for it. And if you did treat them as true peers and you had a good faith conversation with them, first of all, are they likely to go post nasty things about you on social media? In my opinion, that wouldn't happen very often because they felt respected. But yeah, some of them might.
It could.
Yeah, it could happen. And that's what leadership is for. You might get maligned on social media, but if you've gone through that thoughtful, respectful process, then stand by it.
I think that's fair, and it's a great liaison to the perspective piece that was published in the New England Journal under Dr. Rosenbaum's name, and to some of the anecdotes that pertain to the same issue. The perspective piece tries to make the same concern, that there's a problem for medical educators in showing that there's some forms of discomfort are necessary for good education. By the way, that general premise resonates for me. But there's actually an example in that, which I'll read. We're going to go through several anecdotes, but I'd like to read one of them in particular where that threat of being seen in a negative light operated to alter the educational trajectory. And it's the case of Dr. L, which I'd like to read to you. Is that okay?
Sure.
And by the way, this is a very interesting story. One attending, I'll call Dr. L, recalled a recent rotation during which a string of unusual errors occurred. Seeking the cause, Dr. L discovered that the team's resident was rounding on the charts, but not actually seeing the patients. Dr. L raised the problem with the resident, who replied that Dr. L's expectations were too high and insufficiently cognizant of the traumas she'd experienced. She accused Dr. L, who was female, of not understanding what it's like to be a woman in medicine and suggested that the attending was essentially telling her to smile more, a common way of objectifying women. Though Dr. L said it was one of the hardest moments of her professional life, she recognized the effectiveness of the resident's strategy, with the ever-present threat that such interactions will be broadcast on social media and the popularity contest among educators to be most like, quote unquote. Dr. L's fear of reputational harm and losing her job compromised her ability to help the resident become the best doctor she could be. It's a perfect example, Dr. L said, of how far we've fallen. Here's the example of a kind of a damning instance where the resident is doing something that is really a threat to patient care. Dr. L is trying to remonstrate and is accused of being sexist and misogynist and of not understanding what it's like to be a woman when she is a woman. And Dr. L felt pushed to fold out of fear of being potentially fired. So what is that? That to me connects with this storyline that we're building up, that there's something going on where the dialogue goes to a place of feeling like you could undermine me, and so I can't remonstrate with you for potentially dangerous care. What are your thoughts on that, Saul?
I mean, frankly, I thought Dr. L's response was baffling. So again, just to summarize, you're the attending, you have a resident who isn't rounding on their patients, they're just reviewing the charts, and you're seeing errors all over the place. And you confront that resident, and the resident says, you're being unfair, you're targeting me for being a woman, et cetera, et cetera. And, your response is, oh, what can I do? They've got me. There's nothing I can do here. To me, that is a failure to do your job as an attending in terms of protecting your patients and also in terms of your role as an educator. Obviously, any resident who's not rounding on their patients, not actually seeing them, and is just doing chart reviews, is not doing their job in the most fundamental, basic way. I don't think anyone could argue with that. And if they're trying to defend it on some whatever the ground is, in this case, that you're attacking me because I'm a woman. Again, irony here is that the attending's a woman too, but that's not acceptable. I mean, as an attending, first of all, if you don't intervene, you are not serving your patients, that you're ultimately legally responsible. And secondly, as an educator, you're not doing your job. You have recourse here. First of all, you can go to the program director who is in charge of supervising the resident and say, we got a problem here. We got a resident who isn't rounding on their patients and doesn't see a problem with that and is pushing back when I raise this concern with them. It's a huge red flag. And so the idea that you just have to roll over and say, it's a perfect example. Basically, they got me. It's going to be reputational harm to me. Honestly, I don't get it. And, maybe there's a concern this resident's going to go on social media. Who knows? But the responsibility of the attending seems clear.
There's some positionality. You and I are men in our 50s or so. We have more power just because of the privilege that we have in society. Maybe we're not understanding the vulnerability that could apply to someone who feels less privilege, less power. And I mean an attending in this case, but an attending physician. And that this idea that the medical school might roll over on you, or the administration might not support you, or that the student could undermine you, maybe we need to give that more weight, Saul. I wonder if you're showing an insufficient patience with this concern.
I guess I would take that more seriously if the story had gone a bit further and we heard that Dr. L had gone to the program director and the program director had shot Dr. L down. Dr. L had gone to the program director and said, we have a major issue here. We have a resident who isn't rounding on her patients and there are all kinds of errors and is unreceptive when I raise concerns. If she went to the program director and the program director said, who do you think you are, et cetera, and turned against the attending, then I would be like, wow, that's really shocking. But we're not getting that. All we're being told is that Dr. L felt like she didn't really have any recourse. And I just don't see that. I mean, I do agree with you, by the way, that we still live in a world where men are safer the workplace than women are. But I just don't think that the story here goes far enough for us to say that Dr. L had taken action and been rebuffed.
Here's one thing I think you might agree on with Dr. L, though. We might say, look, if you run a residency program or you run a medical school, you should be able to show the faculty that when you have a concern about care that puts patient safety at risk, we will have your back. That message has to be said. We don't know if that message was never said where Dr. L worked, but if it wasn't said, that would have been an egregious gap. It needs to be clear to everybody, no matter how junior you are, if you are unable to see a way to resolving a threat to patient safety, you need to know that the next level up will absolutely try to help understand and fix and remediate and protect patients from any learner who's having difficulty at that moment in time. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I'd agree. Although what's interesting is in this quote, what we're told is her fear was not that the program director wouldn't support her. It was social media. It says
right
here, and I'm reading what you read, it says, the ever-present threat that such interactions, meaning a conversation between the attending and the resident about this issue, will be broadcast on social media and, quote, the popularity contest among educators to be the most liked, unquote. It was because of that Dr. L's fear of reputational harm led to her feeling paralyzed, that she couldn't do anything. And so I think in this case, it was really expressed as a concern about what would happen on social media.
Yeah. No, I get that. And I think that one of the hard things I've learned is that sometimes when you do the right thing, people don't like it. And there is some real pain that comes with learning that. It's not been easy for me all the time. So for the person who is like Dr. L in the future, please stand up, try to do the right thing, but listen. And that's part of what you're also asking is can there be a conversation? I wonder if we can turn to another anecdote from that story. It's the first one. It says it's about a Dr. A who did a lot of extra work and who began to think that they were breaking the norms by working hard. During his internal medicine clerkship, Dr. A, now an intern, dove into tasks medical students often undertake, getting outside records, faxing forms, updating patients' primary care physicians. But he sensed that some of his peers disapproved of his willingness to engage in such scut work. Believing that these tasks weren't educational, fellow students suggested that by leaning into them instead of setting boundaries, he was reinforcing problematic norms. Dr. A saw the work as integral to both his education and patient care, but he found it difficult to challenge their perceptions. If you disagree with someone who's trying to set such boundaries, he explained, you're seen as, quote, part of a toxic culture and not supporting people in their wellness. And she says, Dr. Roosevelt writes, several educators around the United States told me stories revealing a similar dynamic. Once routine aspects of education or training are now deemed potentially harmful. So this is an opening of sorts that says, look, the students are now against working hard, and the ones who do feel like they're at risk. It's a cultural statement. Is it true?
Well, so first of all, this is, again, one of those situations where I'm going to have to take this at face value because in my experience at my own institution, where I'm also a clinician educator, I just haven't seen this. I can't, I've never seen a situation where a medical student was basically helping out with, as it says here, updating patients' primary care physicians, getting outside records, et cetera, and they were actually called out by other medical students for essentially doing too much, supporting the patriarchy, and it's kind of what they're saying here. Like there's a system of injustice, and you shouldn't do this, and so forth. And then the medical student feeling cowed by that and saying, "Oh, all right, okay, I won't help out anymore," et cetera. That's what we're being told is sort of this pervasive culture. Again, I'm going to take it at face value. I haven't seen it myself. I don't know, Stefan, have you? I know you're on wards right now, actually.
I'm on the wards. I see students work hard, and I notice that they get plaudits every time they do extra work. So, no, I haven't seen this, but let's just try to take this as there's no reason to think Dr. A made this up, right? Dr. A at least reported this, so we have to take this.
Yeah. And so I guess in this situation, let's play out maybe how there's a missed opportunity here for a conversation, because I think if there's any theme today, it's missed opportunities. And so what I might say to Dr. A is, well, so it sounds like you feel like you're learning from helping out in this way, from updating patients' primary care physicians, getting outside forms and so forth. And you feel like what you're doing is beneficial to patient care. Is that correct? And we're being told that, yes, Dr. A feels that.
Yes, I'm going to say that. I'm Dr. A. I say, yes, absolutely. It really does feel right to me.
Right. Okay. And you're being told by other medical students that you're essentially feeding into, an unhealthy culture. Okay. So what I would say to them is, look, you're going to go through a career, through a life where people sometimes give you a hard time over all kinds of stuff. And are you going to just cave to that? Or are you going to stand up for what you believe in and do what you think is important for your own education and for the well-being of patients? It's a great opportunity to have that conversation because it's fundamentally about professionalism. Part of professionalism is having an understanding of what your values are and what's right, and recognizing that that's what you live by. And I think that not having that conversation is a missed opportunity for an attending to help a young future physician grow in ways that are vital to being ethical and to ultimately becoming a leader.
I must say that regardless of whether we think lots of students are this way or not, I happen to think not, but regardless, well, one thing I know really hasn't changed over human history is the tendency for people to be criticized for doing what was very often the right thing.
Yes.
Humanity is very good at taking down people who try to do the right thing at a given moment in time. And the person who can say, I'm still going to do the right thing and is willing to listen, willing to learn, but hold to that actually can make a real difference. And that's what I would offer Dr. A if I were so approached. Let me give you another one. This is actually about celebrating accomplishment, which Dr. Roosevelt suggests that celebrating accomplishment is itself now kind of on a downturn in medical schools. She writes, a vice dean of education told me that students concerned about peer-to-peer comparisons had protested the existence of the Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society. Educators described being admonished for giving medical students or trainees any negative feedback and being told to include only positive comments on the written record. Summarizing this shift, One recent chief resident observed, "It's become almost cool to view being a doctor or medical training and the demands that come with it as a huge slight and unfair. Like celebrating success is now bad, and feeling like we're being made to suffer because we're in the medical profession is now good." And Rosenbaum's raising a little bit of alarm about this. Are we being cowed into feeling nervous about celebrating success? Is that what's happened here?
Again, I haven't had a lot of students or colleagues raising concerns about acknowledging the accomplishments of others in domains like getting grades. I believe there's another one here that has to do with faculty who are winning awards and getting grants.
Yes, and tweeting it out. The Department X account was, in one instance, celebrating the accomplishments of faculty. And an external visiting speaker is described by Dr. Rosenbaum as saying, look, this is kind of part of a negative culture that we create when we start continuously posting announcements of the major grants and awards that people win. So, yeah, I mean, come on, Saul. Don't you feel inferior when people get celebrated? And doesn't it feel like it's a little toxic on you at that moment? Because I do. I'm like, wow, I didn't get that one. And now I'm worse than them. And they're just doing this to me. They keep celebrating other people's successes. And I feel bad. I'm not lying, by the way. I'm not just playing this up. I always feel a tad inferior when somebody gets the award I was hoping to get.
So, I think that this is, again, an opportunity for conversation because absolutely there is a tendency, for instance, for particularly research-based medical schools to reward only very specific types of achievement, like getting big grants, for instance, or publishing in the New England Journal of Medicine. And I think that that is an opportunity for raising questions about why aren't we celebrating other kinds of success? What is our mission as an organization? And if our mission includes a range of values, including outstanding clinical leadership, medical education leadership, and maybe people who have extraordinary service to the community. Why are we not celebrating that more? Why is that often celebrated in a kind of token way and not really put on the same pedestal as, say, getting an NIH grant and so forth? And I think those are legitimate conversations. And so I think to just dismiss them and say this is just another example of whiners is a missed opportunity to have a conversation about what culture do we actually want here and how are we going to support that culture by who we recognize. And I think that that's true both at the AOA level, which is for medical students, of course, and at the, tweeting out NIH grants, which is typically at the faculty level. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do these things, but there should be conversation about why people are concerned and whether there's an opportunity here for us to grow as an organization.
Yeah, I think it's possible to complain about the way that the press office reports things and brags. In fact, I remember giving at my own graduation from medical school, I gave a talk about the value of just showing up for individual patients, even if there were no announcements of how great it was that you did that. And so I do think it is, I think it's possible to complain about that, but I think the much better thing is to see it as an invitation to begin celebrating the really hard grunt work that people do when they show up for their individual patients, when they relate to the community, when they help bring people together. And yes, I think we should say, let's celebrate that. And if we have influence, let's celebrate that intentionally.
I might even push the conversation further and say that if people are pained and hurt by the recognition of others, it's worth hearing them out and saying, well, do you feel there are things that you have been achieving in your work and in your life as a physician that are being overlooked? I mean, I think that is often the unspoken narrative here. Somebody is thinking about how their efforts are not being recognized and they start to feel overlooked and not valued. And so I think, again, opportunities here when people get upset for genuine conversation.
Which is not the same as complaining about their being upset, is it?
It's not. It's not.
I want to turn to another one, which I think is kind of interesting. The theme of this here is Gen Z complains a lot and they aren't willing to work hard. And it concerns organic chemistry of all things. And the crazy thing about this episode, which is in Dr. Rosenbaum's articles, we did an entire episode on it called Organic Chemistry and the Questionable Ways We Select and Train Physicians, November 16, 2022. And it concerns a New York University or NYU organic chemistry professor. And I'm going to be quoting from Dr. Rosenbaum's article. In October 2022, the New York Times published a feature about a renowned chemistry professor who'd been fired from New York University after students filed a petition saying his class was too hard and would keep them from getting into medical school. The Times story generated much debate. Is chemistry relevant to practicing medicine? Was the professor simply a jerk? But the students' petition, which notes that, quote, a class with such a high percentage of withdrawals and low grades has failed to make students' learning and well-being a priority, close quote, raises an essential question for medicine as well. Does the pursuit of excellence conflict with the pursuit of well-being? And Dr. Rosenbaum titles this section, Excellence as Offense. That is, that excellence itself could be an offense. Is that where we are at? Have we kind of fallen into this trap of looking down on excellence?
So as you said, we did an episode just on this story because we thought that it was so relevant, again, to the theme of the culture in which we identify, train, prepare people to be future physicians. And Dr. Rosenbaum's statement that one of the questions is whether, quote, chemistry is relevant to practicing medicine does not fit with my take on what was going on here. I think it was much more about how much chemistry is relevant to practicing medicine. And, the concern that was being raised here was not that the students were saying, we don't want to learn any chemistry. By the way, they had all done chemistry. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in organic chemistry. But it was that the course was, quote, too hard. Now, having been through organic chemistry, I can tell you that I don't remember much of it. I don't use much of it. And I do recall that so much time was spent learning these long reactions and memorizing all kinds of stuff that at this point I find very hard to connect to being a physician. And I think the point of the episode that we ran is that there is a legitimate conversation to be had about whether organic chemistry, as it currently is taught in many places, is the right way to decide who is going to get into medical school or not, because it's well understood that it's a gatekeeping type of course. A lot of people don't do well, they drop out, and they don't apply to medical school. And so I think it's somewhat, again, in my view, dismissive to say that this was just about, is chemistry relevant to practicing medicine? And to title it Excellence as Offense, to title that section of this New England Journal of Medicine article, Excellence as Offense, is, in my view, is a kind of judgment that the students who are pushing back on this organic chemistry course were not interested in excellence.
They're just against excellence, yes.
Perhaps from the standpoint of a chemistry graduate program, pushing back might have been a threat to excellence. But I think pushing back from the standpoint of I want to be a future physician is not necessarily at all about excellence. It's about a legitimate conversation about how are we picking people to be future physicians. And I think that there's a critical need to have that conversation rather than just dismiss people who are trying to have it.
It's really interesting because I think about my own career, and I guess I had the biggest problems in chemistry, organic chemistry, and biochemistry. And it beat each of those three and I was a good student, I generally did well, but each of those three created a crisis point where my grades dropped, or I got suddenly an F for the first time, or something bad. So I'm not suggesting I'm excellent today. I have much room for improvement, but I did become a professor. I did try to teach and learn and continue to participate in the life of medicine, and I love it. And I have to admit, I think that excellence in medicine can be distinguished from mastering organic chemistry. They're not the same thing.
And all I'm saying is that if you do think they are the same thing, I don't think you can argue that it's indisputable. I think there is a legitimate case here that there needs to be a conversation about whether that much organic chemistry and that way of filtering who gets into medical school is appropriate. I personally think it isn't. I think that all of those reactions that I struggled over and that some of these students found overwhelming and dispiriting are not relevant, and that they're actually an unnecessary barrier into medical school. Now, others may disagree with me, but I think there's a need for a conversation here. And to say that any attempt to push back is dismissing excellence, I think is a judgment that's premature.
But it's a very powerful move when you can say, look, this discussion really is one where you oppose excellence and I'm for it. It kind of makes the conversation stop. But to get back to this, I think that I agree here that it's better just to open the door and ask, how important is this for making a good doctor? Rather than saying, look, this is what we've always done. And the way we do it probably is in pursuit of excellence, and what you think might not be correct. It might not be correct, to be honest, but I agree with you here. We should have a conversation. If our understanding of excellence maybe needs to be at least discussed and potentially evolve over time, it's relevant to ask, how do we make changes over time? And when should we just bend to the wishes that are expressed toward us? When should we just play the role that others want us to play? And I think that's a point that Dr. Rosenbaum wants to make, is that it's not always possible and it's not always feasible to play simply whatever role an audience is demanding of you. And she gives a very powerful example that can be analyzed from multiple perspectives, some of which might not be her own, but which I think are really important. So I want to read this episode verbatim. During an away rotation in medical school, she writes about herself, I received feedback from a renowned attending, or more precisely from his fellow, to whom he'd outsourced that unfun task. After a few false starts, she indicated that I came off as too youthful, perhaps unserious, definitely naive. Quote, and they're quoting this fellow, maybe you could change your hair? She suggested. I reached back to find my hair in a ponytail, as usual. Quote, or your voice? She added. My voice? I asked self-consciously. How can I change my voice? She acknowledged that it was difficult. We just want what's best for you, she said. This interaction has stuck with me, Dr. Rosenbaum writes, but it didn't harm me. Though I loved parts of medical school, I disliked the way our daily lives, particularly in the clinical years, felt like a performance, a game I wasn't sure I wanted to play. Yet I also understood that the attending was genuinely trying to help me fit into a culture he didn't know how to change. And she goes on to write, that culture has since changed, partly for the better. I want to ask Saul if that story tells other stories within it.
I think that it's telling that she makes the comment that at the time when she was going through this, you just had to suck it up. That basically, if you got what is essentially a misogynist comment about how your voice is too high, you look too young, the kind of things that are said to women, that you basically had to suck it up. And it's not that big a deal. Just do it. They mean well. They can't change the culture. They're just trying to,
help you along.
Right?
Help you along.
And that's her message. But then she ends with this telling comment that things have since changed. What ran through my head is, well, how do you think things changed? They changed because there were people who did push back. They didn't change because everyone just went along with it. That's not how change occurs. Change never happens without people speaking up. Now, I'm not criticizing her and saying that she should have put up a fuss and said what you're doing is unjust, it's misogynist. That's up to her, okay? And I totally get it. But what I'm saying is, recognize that it was because other people made a fuss that change happened. And so when we talk now about the challenges of having medical students and trainees speak up and say, this isn't right, it isn't good, and we get annoyed with them, remember, they're the ones who are driving change. And I think if you yourself were somebody who kind of just went along for the ride and just accepted things, fine, okay. But you're also probably more prone to not appreciating when, now that it's your turn to be in charge, the next generation is pushing back. And what we're seeing here, and I'm not faulting Dr. Rosenbaum for just saying, I'm just going to roll with it, but it may be more difficult for her and perhaps for Dr. Holthauser to recognize that now they're hearing from students and residents who have concerns, some of which are probably legitimate and some of which may not be. And that's how change happens. And it is only possible when people push and when you become receptive and start to listen.
Yeah, it's a complicated story, but the phrase that caught us both is, though that culture has since changed, partly for the better, it just happened on its own, and you and I both don't accept that it happened on its own. Somebody had to push for it to change. I do want to credit that saying, I am not going to bend to just whatever people demand of me is actually kind of strength here. I think Dr. Rosenbaum's statement that She wasn't going to change her voice.
Well, I think her statement was she can't change her voice. I mean, I think what she's describing as an act of strength, although she doesn't use that term, is the fact that she just sucked it up and let it roll and didn't make a big deal out of it. I mean, I think that's her point. I didn't make a big deal out of this. I knew they meant well. I knew they couldn't change the culture and they were just trying to help me, and I just let it roll. I think that's her message. And what I'm saying is that isn't my view of strength. I think it's fine, but I wouldn't call it strength. And I'm not criticizing her for it, but it isn't strength.
We would be hypocrites if we criticized her for it, because you and I have both rolled along at various times, just to be very clear. Yeah.
Of course. I absolutely. But the people who I would single out as showing strength are the ones who speak up, the rare ones who speak up and say, hey, I think this is kind of a problem. Here's why I think it's a problem. And so I think that's strength, right?
But those people who say, hey, I think it's a problem, here's why I think it's a problem, some of those people are potentially just random complainers who complain all the time. Is that possible? Who we should discredit from the start?
Well, I don't think you know who's who until you start to have a conversation with them, right? So once you start to have a conversation with them, it plays out. If they are in good faith, it becomes a dialogue and you start to learn from each other. If they're just chronic complainers, that will become evident as well. And both of those types of people are circulating.
We do have to interact with all kinds. And I think that there is a certain openness that we're trying to engage in here, to say when people tell a story about what's happened to them and what they think is important, it's the beginning of something that we can learn more about, potentially so that we can shift in our own views. Sometimes not, sometimes yes, but it's the beginning of something, and it would be helpful to open that door, not close it. I want to ask, from your point of view, is there an overall take-home that resonates for you? And I'll just say at a personal level, when I read this, I resonated with the idea that we need to be willing to demand hard work. And I resonated with the idea that discomfort very often is part of what goes into building quality. And I felt at odds with the notion that our colleagues who are students are children. And it felt wrong to me. But I want to know, is there a larger message here?
Well, Dr. Rosenbaum ends her article with the following. She says, quote, "We can't address the factors actually compromising trainee well-being if we can't separate them from the cultural forces rewarding declarations of being unwell. How then to separate the narrative from the reality?" And I think the answer to that question is by having respectful dialogue with the trainees and students who are raising these concerns and seeing them as junior colleagues rather than as children, and having the humility to recognize that they may have something to offer and that the traditional hierarchy, which has been disrupted to some significant degree by social media, is perhaps a healthy beginning to a more equitable approach to creating a healthy medical education culture. And that if we can see that, this is actually a potentially very fruitful time for transforming the culture in which we grow the next generation of physicians. And I think that's the message that I'm hoping this conversation can contribute to the discussion.
So I'll close out by saying thank you very much, Saul, for helping us through this conversation. And I want to say specifically for people who've listened to this episode and maybe wrestled with the postings from New England Journal of Medicine, our ears are open. We're interested in conversation. And I'm personally very interested in hearing people tell us why we got this one right or why we're full of it. Both are welcome messages for us to learn from in this case. And thanks so much, Saul, for this episode.
Thanks, Stefan. We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app, as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.